Well, that's today's news. Well, let's take a look at tomorrow's with Labour's former Justice Minister Shahid Malik and the Reuters Breaking Views journalist Margaret Doyle. Nice to see you both. We've got a few of the papers have come through to us. So let's start off with The Independent, which is, as ever, often the first one in. And it, like many of the front pages, is leading with David Cameron's speech in the House today. He's announced a number of new measures, including ordering people to remove hoods in a bid to tackle gang culture. Shahid, what was your feelings about what he said?
I've got to say, on that particular point of the hoods, I actually proposed this in November 2006, both the removing of hoods and masks during demonstrations and the burning of flags, because it incites violence potentially. So, I think that's common sense. I think there are other measures that were announced that actually might be quite difficult to implement. So, for example, around social networks, I think everybody understands the logic. How would it actually work in practice? And also, rioters could lose their benefits and homes. I think most of the people watching this evening will say, good on you. But actually, if the implication of that is that it creates more problems for society, is it the right thing to do? I'm not saying it is or isn't. All I'm saying is there are unintended consequences of some of the initiatives that have been announced. And if it's too knee-jerky, it could store up problems for the future.
Margaret's not nodding there when you're talking about the enforcement. It is difficult.
I think that Shahid is right on 2 points. I think first of all, it'll be very difficult to do. And then secondly, there will be a lot of unintended consequences. And I think it's somewhat ironic that David Cameron, who of course had a very strong civil liberties agenda when people like Shahid and his colleagues were implementing kind of the anti-terror legislation, you know, the kind of trying to put in 90-day detention without trial. It's ironic that here David Cameron is, and we're not looking at a major terrorist incident, we're looking at rioting. And he, of course, feels the pressure and he feels that he has to kind of promise to take a very tough line. And I'm just somewhat sceptical as to whether that tough line, however tempting it may be, whether he can pull it off.
You tried to implement the ruling about people removing their face covering in 2000. Why didn't it go through in 2003? Who blocked it?
People didn't think there was a need for it. None of the political parties felt there was a need for it. Certainly the Tories weren't supporting it, but nobody did. Actually, the only person that did was one of the assistant commissioners at the Met at the time. And that's because of my own experiences during demonstrations, watching people take advantage and exploit them. So I thought there was a logic in that. But I also think, in many ways, what you saw today in Parliament, I mean, absolutely right that Parliament was recalled, but I think what you saw was a consensus around the way that policing had commenced during these disturbances and where it got to now. I think people were trying to be, you know, it's a bit like the nursing profession. You can't really criticise them. It doesn't go down well. The police are almost the same in many ways in that chamber. But the truth is, if you ask Joan and Jean Public, you know, what did you think of the police operations on day 1, day 2, day 3? They will say they were appalled. But the important thing is, those police officers, I am sure, were as frustrated as anybody else. They were being told to behave in a certain manner because they've got to follow the operational command.
I think there is a big debate about the sort of policing that we have. There was a very interesting article actually in today's paper rather than tomorrow's, but in the FT, which was saying we've got to return to this Sir Robert Peel's ideal of policing, which is the Bobby on the beat, that the police are there not just to kind of clean up after crime has been committed, but also to deter crime by their presence on the street.
Now, I know the police are on the front of a lot of the pages, so I think we'll come to them in a little bit more detail in a moment. But I just want to take you back briefly, Shade, to something you said a while ago about the losing homes and benefits and how, you know, would this work? I think the problem is, and certainly looking at a lot of the emails that we're getting, a lot of our viewers are saying there needs to be consequences, and the consequences that there are for a lot of these people, community service orders, or they're too young to actually face any kind of punishment. Wouldn't something like that, losing homes, losing benefits, wouldn't that actually make a difference?
I mean, the consequences should be in the courts of this land. That's where the consequences should be. That's where they should feel the full brunt of the law. And magistrates and judges ought to be given the highest tariff that is possible. Beyond that, I'm not sure how practical and possible it is. I'm not saying don't do it. What I am saying is that it's actually very, very difficult to think how you would do it. If you're splitting up families because of one person who's committed an act, whether it's a parent or a child? What are the implications? Will they be drawn more to criminality, etc., etc.? I don't know. But I think it's important to raise these points now, because what we don't want, I think, as I said earlier, is unintended consequences. The one thing that every parliamentarian fears is pushing through legislation quickly and then having to deal with the unintended consequences. So it's not that I'm opposing it. I think it's got to be thought through. And I'm just concerned that practically it might be more difficult to do. It's a good soundbite. Listen, it's popular. You've had lots of people phoning in. Of course it's popular. Cameron is going to say it. I've no issue with that. Will he be able to do it? That is the question, in a way that helps society rather than damages society.
Well, there's certainly been, 100,000 people on the e-petition website, so, you know, there is a possibility it is going to get debated in the House, isn't there?
Yeah, a backbench committee now will decide. I mean, all that does, it kind of flags it up. A backbench committee then decides whether it ought to be debated. But on gangs, there's a superb report done in June 2010 by the chief inspectors of the prison, probation and constabulary on gangs and children and young people. So a lot of the stuff is already there, but it hasn't really been looked at or implemented. I think that will now be hurried through.
Let's move on to the I newspaper, and this also leading on David Cameron's speech. Its top slug there is the role of social media in crime to be reviewed. And Margaret, do you think...
Again, it's easy to say, but tough to do. And when we look at countries like, say, Egypt, where the authorities, during the Arab Spring, during the uprising, the authorities, I think, ordered Vodafone to close down the network, and we were all appalled. If you look at China and the way in which China tries to censor the internet, we all are kind of horrified by that. Similarly, Syria doesn't allow journalists in. So as someone who is a journalist, I get very nervous when I see any attempt made to kind of, as it were, kill the messenger or shut down the means of communication, rather than perhaps looking more fundamentally at the causes of this sort of unrest.
I think it's twin-edged in the sense that while people are putting things out on social media, it gives a chance for the police and the intelligence services to sift through it and find which bits actually are useful. They've got to come to a conclusion on whether it's more beneficial to have it or not. And that's a conclusion that the police and the intelligence services will come to. But there's no doubt, as Margaret says, China now will be pointing its finger and saying, well, you criticised us on Twitter, you're trying to deal with it, or BlackBerry Messenger, whatever it might be.
We've already heard
Syria,
similar noises from Iran already, haven't we?
Syria,
today?
which is completely mad, and we just heard earlier on, where he's saying, well, why can David Cameron call them gangs and we can't in Syria? I'm sorry, reality check, you've just killed 2,000 people. You know, nobody in this government, or this country none of the authorities have killed anybody. We've had, sadly, 4 deaths.
I think
not by the authorities.
Maybe a more important lesson, Shahid, is for the police, that the police need to kind of come up to date. So on the one hand, they perhaps need to be, doing some sort of 19th century style, Bobby on the beat, Sir Robert Peel type of policing. But on the other hand, they need to understand how young people communicate. And if it is the case that stuff is being organised on Twitter, surely the police should be monitoring that. I mean, it's not a secret. I mean, the whole point about social media is that they're public.
Well, I'm sure they were. I'm sure that was where they were getting a large amount of their information as well.
But then why were they sort of so slow to react and to deploy personnel in the areas that they knew were going to be targeted?
Indeed. Well, that's the million-dollar question. Police is on the front of the Financial Times, which we will be taking a quick look at when we come back after this very short break. Do stay with us.